morning, friends. Our presenter today is a young but a very dynamic teacher of Delhi University, Dr. Sarvchetan Katoch. He is an associate professor of English at Shahid Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi. Today he is going to speak to us on the topic Hindi cinema in the 21st century. The topic is intriguing and as well as I think a provocative topic, and we look forward to Dr. Sarvchetan Katoch's lecture. Dr. Katoch has a PhD in English literature from Punjab University, Chandigarh. His academic interests are in modern Indian literature, literature of the Indian diaspora, literary theory, film and cultural studies, and also translation studies. He has received a couple of prestigious academic fellowships, and he has pursued work with the Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Iowa, USA, and he has also been the fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla. He has published a number of articles on Indian cinema and Indian literature, Hindi cinema, in various academic journals. And presently he is working on a book titled The Spinning Wheel, Reclaiming Swaraj Through Rachnatmak Hindi Cinema. So let us listen to Dr. Sarvchetan Katoch on Hindi cinema in the 21st century. Thank you.
Yeah, namaskar. Thank you, Professor Nirmalya, for inviting me to this refresher course and giving me this opportunity to interact with young scholars and teachers spread across India, those who have come for this course and have shown interest in Hindi cinema or Indian cinema for that matter. I'll just share my views on Hindi cinema, especially its evolution and how Hindi cinema emerges as one of the most appreciated and also most popular cinemas of India. Now, why I say cinemas of India, because and that's also obvious in my title when I say Hindi cinema in the 21st century, rather than using Bollywood in the 21st century or something like that, because I have something in my mind that the distinction between Bollywood and Hindi cinema needs to be drawn, and it has to be very clearly demarcated. So the thing is that when I say cinema as Hindi cinema as one of the cinemas of India, when I choose this topic, or when I specifically mention or keep my title as Hindi cinema instead of Bollywood, I try to establish something and also try to underscore a very important aspect of Hindi cinema, that it is one of the major cinemas of India. Cinema exists in India in multiple languages, as is the literature. So when we talk about Indian literature, we do not just talk about Hindi literature as Indian literature. We always talk about Indian literature as a pluralist literature, which includes all kinds of linguistic zones or territories that spread across India. Now, so Hindi cinema, for that matter, is one of the cinemas, because we have Tamil cinema, Malayalam cinema and otherwise. However, it is also important that I must point it out, over the last, say, decade and a half or maybe 2 decades, what we have seen that Hindi cinema has grown by leaps and bounds, and not just the industry which has grown, but also scholarship on Hindi cinema has also grown immensely. And this scholarship, generally what we find, there is a usage, that we find that instead of Hindi cinema, most people just use Bollywood. So most of the books just refer to the history of Hindi cinema as merely the history of Bollywood, which is also important, because when you talk about Bollywood, what it means, I need to point that out. you know. So, when I talk about Hindi cinema and Bollywood, something that needs to be kept in mind is that Bollywood basically is about an industry, and Hindi cinema is a cinema which is produced in a particular language, which happens to be Hindi. And how Hindi cinema emerges and becomes a very significant, and in fact one of the prominent industries or process of filmmaking or cinema, in India is a study in itself. That is something that I thought I must point out right at the very beginning. Now, how does Hindi cinema come into being, or when did it begin its journey? That is something that I need to highlight, and I thought it would be good before I come to 21st century. It is better we go back and just see its journey until now. But then its journey until now, this is something that I believe is also important. Now, Hindi cinema, or rather language cinemas in India, if I may say that, cinema in different languages began almost at the same time, around 1931. Alamara being the first film, first talkie, produced in Hindi, and they were almost at the same time in 1931. There's a film produced in Telugu, then in Tamil, then in Bangla, and suddenly what we see is Indian cinema, as long as it was a silent cinema, which was until 1930 or 1931, suddenly starts becoming truly Indian. Because as long as it was a silent cinema, the medium dominated more, and we found narratives which needed to be understood by people, and there was some kind of background score or some music played out during the screening. That was happening at that time, but it was merely Indian cinema. While it represented, as if the entire Indian subcontinent for that matter, but it could be a great cinema. I'm not undermining silent cinema. It has its contribution. It is immensely powerful. There is a language of silent cinema that needs to be studied, and people have done that. Innumerable studies are there. But what is interesting, what makes this journey or this introduction of talkies in India important is something that I must highlight for a moment, because if you are talking about French cinema or American cinema or British cinema or otherwise, they are largely dominated, they are one language cinemas. So, this transition from silent to say introduction of language or introduction of voice in cinema with talkies in England is not a major shift. It still remained an English British cinema. But in India, the moment talkies became were introduced, it started becoming Indian in true sense, because then it brought the various the different flavors that existed across India. So, now flavors in the sense that now a Bangla flavor comes, and Tamil flavor comes, and Telugu flavor, and Hindi certainly. So, all these languages coming together and then cinema being produced, then suddenly you find that yes, because Indian cinema is, or Indianness is pluralist, it is multilingual. So, these languages started being, started producing, or cinema being produced in these languages. Suddenly, we realize, oh, now Indian cinema is emerging. So, yes, undoubtedly, with D.G. Phalke producing his Raja Harishchandra, as the first Indian, film, which is just a precursor to Alamara and Bhakt Prahlad and various other films to emerge. Now, Bhakt Prahlad, when I refer to, was the first Telugu film, which was produced around the same time in 1931. So, now suddenly what we see is the journey from Harishchandra from Falke's experiment to this new mode is an interesting journey, and it's a break point. It's a point of departure in one sense, or it's a point of departure is not necessarily moving away. Point of departure is also building further. So the growth of cinema then takes a new turn, and then how it starts accommodating. So when we talk about Indian culture, Indian civilization being the civilization of composite culture, like, assimilation and all of that, that is something. The beautiful example is that how cinema assimilates different languages and then offers a new medium to people and all creative minds, to experiment and to express themselves through using their language, in a particular new medium. So it is this moment, 1931, when Hindi cinema starts, featuring or starts rolling out, or cinema starts rolling out films, or cinema in India start rolling out films in Hindi alongside other, languages. So I have that particular aspect in my mind when I talk about Hindi cinema. So not to say that it is the only industry, which sometimes even Goa and others also say that Hindi cinema is the de facto national cinema. Yes, indeed it is. It is one of the most popular industries. It is an industry that brings in, or that invites people from all over India. So and this tradition of Hindi cinema, assimilating great and creative minds from various linguistic zones is also, it dates back, it goes back to 1920s and 30s and even to 40s. Interestingly, like when we talk about V. Shantaram, a Marathi, produces films both in Marathi and Hindi simultaneously, and then he is more popular in Hindi world than in Marathi world, for that matter. So there is no, Bimal Roy decides ki I will now make films in Bombay. Most of the great stalwarts of Bangla cinema moved to this place. Stalwarts from down south, from Tamil and Telugu, they come to Bombay, and they say that okay, they want to reach a wider, a bigger audience, and they would like to have a pan-Indian appeal and pan-Indian audience or viewership. And they all come to this side, and it's happening even now. So it started. So it's not like it's a trend that began with the very beginning of Hindi cinema, and people, you find it being mentioned in Madhav Prasad's ideology of Hindi cinema and various other histories of Hindi cinema, or Bombay film industry for that matter. That how it was, how it accommodated creative minds from all over, like Shyam Benegal coming from Andhra or down south, Guru Dutt, also all of them, Punjabi film, the entire Punjabi film or Punjabi cinema eventually absorbed into Hindi cinema and all of that. So this is very interesting. So besides, yes, even Goa talks about that, how it offers a vocabulary, new phraseology, a common language for people to interact for all Indians. So like you go to Tamil Nadu or elsewhere, which is also interesting, that you see that Hindi cinema is screened there in Hindi itself. It's not dubbed into Tamil or something. There is a trend which we see recently, that films from South come and they are being dubbed into Hindi. It's a new thing that many people can study, that how Hindi cinema is dubbed. So as we talk about modern Indian literature or Indian literature in translation, so we can also talk about Hindi cinema in dubbing or in this new way of or Indian cinema in Hindi dubbing, for that matter. Something like that we can talk about it. This is something that I had in my mind. Yes, so this is the importance of Hindi cinema and why we need to talk about Hindi cinema. But another important thing is that Hindi cinema, why we need to use Hindi cinema, not Bollywood, is that perhaps, and I could be wrong in saying that, but I personally believe that the biggest advocate or campaigner for Hindi you know, in the 20th century or even in the 21st century, you know, happens to be Hindi cinema. So, Hindi cinema has taken or has popularized Hindi not just in non-Hindi regions of India, but also outside India. So, people across the globe want to learn Hindi because they want to understand Hindi cinema, number one. Another important thing is literature is very important, and when we read Hindi literature, you know, there are all kinds of terms in it. There are terms borrowed from Urdu, from other linguistic zones and all that, or largely Sanskritized terms. The kind of Hindi which was taken up by or जिसकी promotion के लिए इंडियन गवर्नमेंट्स ने, वेरियस गवर्नमेंट्स ने बड़े एफर्ट्स किए, और जो बड़ी एक ऑफिशियल लैंग्वेज जो हम हिंदी देखते हैं, विच बिकम्स ऑल द मोर कॉम्प्लिकेटेड, यू नो, बट देन Hindi cinema was enriching Hindi language, and we hardly acknowledge that. Unfortunately, when we talk about Hindi cinema and the language that it uses, we just go into this debate and discussion between that Hindi cinema originally Hindi hai ya ye Urdu hai ya ye Hindustani hai, you know. So these are the debates. Interestingly, ये डिबेट्स भी फर्दर और आगे जाती हैं जब हम इसी लैंग्वेज को बोलते हैं कि ये तो और उसमें भी एक इंटरेस्टिंग टर्न आता है कि अब मुंबईया हिंदी हो गई, अब इंग्लिश हिंदी होगी, बट हिंदी सिनेमा नहीं है ये, मतलब देर आर ऑल काइंड्स ऑफ एफर्ट्स कि नहीं, हिंदी सिनेमा की जो लैंग्वेज है ना वो हिंदी नहीं है, वो हिंदी के सिवाय सब कुछ हो सकती है, यू नो. सो ना परहैप्स हिंदी सिनेमा, I believe over the last 90 years as I talk about it, see 31 से लेकर 2021 तक, इसमें जो एक beautiful part है कि irrespective of all these scholarships or things being written about Hindi cinemas, Hindi cinema continued and with its Hindi, and the richness and the growth or the evolution of language does not lie in it being represented only one kind of literature. It also lies in how people, in a way, or how a language develops itself, evolves itself, grows itself, and incorporates a lot of words from various languages. Finest example is English language. Every year they add words to their dictionary, Oxford Advanced. Do we? I do not know whether we do the same in Hindi dictionaries or not, you know. I doubt whether we do it, or even in Bangla or some other. So we are not even in that process. English is dominating because they are enriching themselves, they are expanding, they are adopting words. Every year hundreds of words are being added. At least Bollywood जिसको आप कह रहे हो, या जो हिंदी सिनेमा जिसको मैं एम्फेसाइज कर रहा हूँ, वो एक इम्पॉर्टेंट एग्जाम्पल है जहाँ पे इस हिंदी को एनरिच होते हुए देखते हो. सम पीपल देन गेट इनटू दिस डिबेट लाइक मुकुल केसवन सेज नो इट इज उर्दू सिनेमा, व्हिच इज बीइंग responded very well by Professor Trivedi, that the rationale for considering Hindi cinema as Urdu cinema or primarily Urdu cinema is also unfounded, or it's not something which can be validated, or which can be given, or which can be proven right, because you just can't pick the titles of some Hindi films or the kind of songs being written or some kind of language being used as the basis for considering or claiming Hindi cinema as Urdu cinema. Or then similarly, Sanskritized terms cannot be argued or cannot be used to argue that no, it is basically Hindi cinema. So largely the understanding is that this kind of debate should go. We need to understand that now in the 21st century, maybe scholarship has not come in terms to, or has not come to agreement with this, but Hindi cinema has come to an agreement. They believe that you may call it whatever. We call it Hindi cinema, and we get it certified as Hindi films, and we produce, and we are enriching language. Some people then go into a new kind of dimension. They say that इसमें एक English की आ रही है. भाई, this is like, I personally believe कि हिंदी के लिए इससे बुरी चीज़ कुछ नहीं हो सकती कि हम इंग्लिश को, मतलब उसमें भी हम इंग्लिश को इम्पोर्टेंस दे रहे हैं. अरे इट कुड बी हिंदी, एनी वर्ड, टेबल, चेयर, ऑल काइंड्स ऑफ थिंग्स आर बीइंग यूज्ड इन हिंदी इज हिंदी. We have to expand Hindi. We cannot be, this is like colonial mindset, I would say. English ho gaya. Why English? It is Hindi. Hindi is also growing. Hindi includes Urdu also. Let us come, perhaps Hindi cinema has in a way, done it in the best possible way. There is no debate on that. We call it Hindi, and our Hindi is inclusive of all other languages, and this is the growth of Hindi. A very significant turn that we have noticed in the 21st century in Hindi cinema is this acceptance and this kind of this I would say composite character of Hindi which is being presented. Now Hindi is when we talk about Hindi language, it's basically a broad term, it's an umbrella term. Hindi is not just one Sanskritized kind of Hindi. Hindi also varies. There are multiple dialects, there are multiple languages or mother languages to Hindi. Now it's not just Sanskrit that which worked in the growth of Hindi, I believe. There is Bhojpuri, Braj, Awadhi, and in fact, Bundeli, Kannauji, and you will find all such dialects or regional, so-called regional. I do not call them regional. They are all, tributaries to this new Hindi that Hindi cinema has, created. And especially you find films coming out based on a particular region tries to bring that Hindi. It's not like Gangs of Wasepur would use a Bombaya kind of Hindi or a Urdu kind of Hindi, for that matter, or many other films like based in UP, Masan for that matter, or many. Interestingly, we have seen some films based on dacoits and all those things of late. But these films use the tongue of that particular region rather than using the dacoit films of 70s and 60s and 70s where a kind of very artificial or a very official kind of Hindi or Urdu or Hindi blend of Hindi was used. So now this is something that is happening. So this debate of Hindi Urdu, of Hindi English or Mumbaiya Hindi is certainly, when a film is based in Mumbai, obviously it will use a Mumbaiya Hindi. The kind of Hindi which is being used. But now in the 21st century what we see is how that language or the language of Mumbai, if it's a film based in Mumbai, it also incorporates or it also uses a lot of Marathi words, the lingua, the common language, the colloquial tongue, which is, so now this colloquiality, that Hindi that exists in Hindi, is also now exploited by Hindi cinema. So now it is becoming more of Hindi cinema because its canvas has increased. It has started bringing out these characters, and that's something that I believe needs to be pointed out when I talk about Hindi cinema here. Now, the second part of it, Hindi cinema and Bollywood. This we need to look at through a historical perspective. I think to understand this Bollywood, which is an industry, which Rajadhyaksha and other talks about Bollywood being a corporatized form of Hindi's film industry, the term gained currency in the 90s, and industry as it gained the corporate status or an industrialized status or industry status in the early 2000 with Sushma Swaraj and being the I&B minister, decided that now the industry status shall be given to cinema, and while the enthusiasts believed that this will liberate cinema from all kind of black money and other practices, and some filmmakers believe that it will give them liberty because now they can borrow money from various banks, and that money, which would be a white money, will allow them to produce the kind of cinema that they wanted to produce. But then there were critics also, and critics also had genuine reasons. They believe that with industry, with this corporate culture, with this capitalist culture, the cinema. And interestingly, Hindi cinema is quite often titled as a cinema of bourgeois or of middle class, or a cinema that caters to a particular class. It ignores the downtrodden, underprivileged. It's a kitsch kind of dance and song, and all kinds of things were written about it. Suddenly things started changing. So, but filmmakers believe that even filmmakers who at times are regarded as the pioneers or champions of art cinema, like Shyam Benegal and others, they believe that yes, this industrial status would certainly liberate, certainly allow them to experiment. While experimental cinema happened, I will come to that history later. But so this industrial status brings a new shift in Indian cinema, and this shift was also encashed by Hindi cinema, and it suddenly what we see is that there is this industry, an industry bringing in more cash, more popularity, more marketing, with a lot of merchandising, a lot of all kinds of paraphernalia which is associated with money and all that, alongside filmmaking. There were apprehensions that it will completely destroy the art, the cinema, the narrative, the beauty, the spirit, which is basically about telling stories, and it will just be become a medium to sell products for various corporate giants and all those things. Unfortunately, none of that happened. But the apprehensions were genuine, which you may find in Rajadhyaksha's essay, Bollywoodization of Indian cinema, written around 2002 or 3, or maybe 2004. Please forgive me for not keeping the exact date of the paper in mind, but anyway. So again, what we see is the new growth and cinema with this kind of marketing and publicity and popularity. I personally believe what comes into Hindi cinema is some kind of accountability, some kind of newfound responsibility, some kind of newfound creativity. What we see with this freedom to produce films, freedom to borrow, freedom to tell your comes freedom to tell your own story, freedom to experiment. Now, this freedom to experiment is also based on experimenting not at the cost of the money invested in filmmaking. Yes, another important thing comes with the emergence of new kind of film viewing. So, you have PVR cinemas and all kinds of things emerging suddenly, and then film viewing becomes an altogether different affair. All of that is happening, and then suddenly all those reservations were completely proven wrong. Then comes what happens, then I would like to point out another important development in the 21st century that happens in Hindi cinema, and perhaps that happens across Indian cinema, even in other languages that you will find, is the erosion of boundaries that we had created in India for cinema. Like there is Hindi cinema, which is a popular Hindi cinema or popular cinema of India, which is basically a commercial cinema. And then there is another cinema which is a parallel cinema, which is art cinema, art filmmaking, as if these two are two different affairs. As if filmmaking in a commercial, making a commercial film is such a child's job. Any person can get up and make a commercial film. As if it's not about storytelling, it's merely about taking a camera, bringing in something and telling a narrative, or it's just telling the same stories again and again. For that matter, Shakespeare also told the same stories that existed at one point of time, but there is a way of telling stories. Certainly there are some films that film critics and scholars picked up, and that they believe that this is the kind of cinema which is the mainstream cinema. So I believe that this understanding needs to be relooked, reviewed. There is some truth to it, but then there are other aspects to Hindi cinema that we need to look at. Now, as I talked about the beginning of Hindi cinema, which began in 1931. 1931, if we just go through the films produced in 1931 itself, interesting, you will be surprised to find that the films that we find, it's not just Ala Mara. फर्स्ट 1931 में 4-5 फिल्म्स टॉकीज़ हिंदी में जो जब हमने हिंदी लैंग्वेज सिनेमा शुरू किया उसमें 4-5 फिल्म्स के मैं आई विल जस्ट रेफर टू दोज 4-5 फिल्म्स. Alamara, which happened to be a period fantasy, which was borrowed from Parsi theatre and all those. Another was Devyani, a mythological. Another one was Draupadi, based on epic Mahabharat, an adaptation. Then Khuda Ki Shan, a film which was a social. It was a film on Dalit issue. And then there was Premi Jogan, another film which was a love ballad kind of narrative, and Shireen Farhaz, again a period film based on one of the 7 ballads or tales of pairs of love ballads that we find in Persian literature and also Punjabi literature and otherwise. So if we just go through these films, there are all kinds of subjects being explored. Now this is just I cited not because that what I want to say is that the variety and the diversity in Hindi cinema has always been there. There are all kinds of films were made all the time. Films in 1930s and 40s and 50s were going to Venice. And the films were produced under the banner of or under this term we call Hindi cinema. So they were all made in Hindi, produced either in Bombay or otherwise many people do not know that there were studios based in Tamil Nadu, Madras, and many films were produced there. Many filmmakers used to rent these studios based in Tamil Nadu or in Madras, or some films were produced simultaneously in different languages at the same time, but all of that was happening. So Hindi cinema, in that sense, so this diversity of subjects of all kinds, everything is art for that matter, and all of that, among all of that, there were very films which were made, of low quality, films just made to amuse people, and all kinds of things so that we generally do not talk about. So now this diversity, this variety of subjects being treated in cinema or being expressed through cinema, through these narratives or these stories that cinema spun over the last so many over the last 9 decades, I would say, have always been there. So it's not like कि एक तरीके का सिनेमा, but interesting क्या है, एक बड़ी interesting development, but until India gains independence, and even after India gains independence until 1960s, that is why I say, and it is also important for me to now come to the second part of my topic, which is 21st century. So when I say in the cinema in the 21st century, I basically have in mind the 90 years of Hindi cinema, and these 90 years could be further divided into 3 different eras of Hindi cinema, which is of 30 years each. So now 1931 to 1960. So this is one phase. Until now, there was not a clear division between parallel art or middle cinema, as we often tend to read in scholarly books on that. For convenience, we can say that it is art, it is parallel, it is something which is very difficult to. But when we use certain specific terms for dividing cinema into on the basis of its aesthetics, on the basis of its art, we certainly tend to take, we certainly get prejudice towards the other cinema. So that's something. This prejudice needs to be gone. So this prejudice is something that I believe it is important to highlight. So 1930s to 1960s, not much of a difference that you find. So now even after the independence, soon after the independence, and many people talk about 1950s and 60s being the golden age of Hindi cinema. So you have Chetan Anand, you have Guru Dutt, you have Raj Kapoor, you have Bimal Roy, you have all great filmmakers making and producing films at that time. Films like Naya Daur, Do Bigha Zameen, Avara, Shri 420, K. Abbas writing scripts along and working along with Raj Kapoor, Guru Dutt and other, Pyasa, Kagaz Ke Phool, all these great films. So that many people consider as the golden era, which is certainly, but you can always say that some phase or some period was golden, another was not golden. But why do we need to come back to from golden to silver, or to bronze? Why can't we go to platinum and the others? So I believe it is the other way round. So now 60s and 50s, what cinema did, or what Hindi cinema did? Hindi cinema responded to its times. It reflected the times, and what we need to look at is how Hindi cinema offers a history of India, and this 30 years there is a shift in Hindi cinema that takes place in 60s, and not in Hindi cinema but in Indian cinema for that matter. It is also the time when FFC comes into being. FFC बनता है, Film Federation Corporation, वो decide करता है कि हम अब films produce करेंगे, हम एक पर्टिकुलर एस्थेटिक्स को प्रमोट करेंगे, एक पर्टिकुलर एस्थेटिक्स को एस्टेब्लिश करेंगे, उस तरीके की फिल्में बनेंगी. नाउ FFC suddenly creates a new kind of cinema, and it says now this is a parallel cinema. Interesting to point out, in 1975 and 76 a survey was conducted about how many films were supported or produced by FFC. बहुत interesting point है ये, that needs to be highlighted. Now this, and irony है कि government is doing this, perhaps Nehru had in mind what Lenin did with cinema, in Russia, to use cinema to create a new kind of mindset, and state supported cinema, socialist जैसा वहाँ पे बन रहा था, सोशलिस्ट रियलिज्म वाला, उसी तरीके का एक नया इंडिया में एक नए इंडिया का कुछ हो जिसमें कुछ सोशलिस्ट कंसर्न्स हो, या वो ऑल दोज थिंग्स आर एक्सेप्टेड, एज इफ Hindi cinema otherwise was not interested in social films, or social films were not being made. Very interesting. Now, suddenly what we see is 675 का सर्वे ये कहता है कि around 60 lakh rupees were spent, films were funded, 30 films were funded, only 16 could be made. Out of these 16, only 6 had some little success at the box office. There were all kinds of reasons cited कि नहीं ये इसलिए नहीं हुआ, promotion ठीक से नहीं हुई, marketing ठीक से नहीं हुई, all kinds of things. Now this 60s से लेकर 80s and 90s तक, which I say another 30 years of Hindi cinema, this trend continued. FFC renamed as NFDC, films were still produced, still funded, but then perhaps even the producers knew that with such meager funding you cannot produce films. That could be one hindrance. But then there was another thing, there was something which was missing, there was something which was needed. And in the 90s, this whole parallel cinema, or this myth of parallel cinema, this myth of art cinema, sorry if I call it a myth, because some would have objection to it, why are you calling it a myth? I understand that there could be there is a point of view, but I have my own point of view. But this was created, it did not come from the cinema itself, because cinema is an open field, it allows you to experiment. Yes, there were certain restrictions with some kind of producers and finances, there were people जो finance करते थे, उनको लगता था कि वो ज़्यादा इसमें उनका से होगा. अब ये सारी चीज़ें कैसे 90s के बाद और अर्ली 2000 के बाद, यही चीज़ें जैसे ही उस इंडस्ट्री से जाती हैं, जैसे ही एक डायरेक्टर could open his own film company or his corporation, suddenly what you see is that a creativity also comes in. So now 90s mein, very decisive moment for many when we talk about new economic policy that was introduced in India. But then many people just focus on that liberalization or post liberalization cinema. They see हम आपके हैं कौन, DDLJ, कुछ होता है, कल होना हो, and all kinds of films based on narratives told about diaspora or NRIs or expats, and all of that suddenly gain importance. But then around that same time there were films produced like Damini, there were films produced like Rosa, there were films produced like Bombay, there were films, other Nobody talked about them, or only a few talked. Madhav Prasad did refer to that. Raghavendran did refer to these films. They have their own take on these films. So suddenly, so with again, and with one kind of cinema, one kind of scholarship, you see that it focused on one side, but then there were other sides. So now suddenly, and then by 2000, what we see an outburst. Suddenly, with new industrial setup, some liberated cinema start emerging. Then you see subject based, social based, political issues. And one interesting factor that I always find in this shift in the early 2000s for that matter, जब तक स्टेट सपोर्ट कर रहा था तब हम एक बड़ा बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग, बहुत ही स्टाइलाइज्ड और बहुत ही एक यूनिक काइंड ऑफ आर्ट फिल्म बना रहे थे. लेकिन जैसे ही स्टेट का सपोर्ट गया, हमें लगा कि कॉर्पोरेटाइज्ड हो गया, अब तो कॉर्पोरेट, हमको एक बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग डेवलपमेंट जो हिंदी सिनेमा में मिली वो ये मिली कि इट बिकेम क्रिटिकल ऑफ द स्टेट. 2000, early 2000 or the first decade or first decade and a half, first 15 years of 21st century, and if you just go through the films, चाहे वो रंग दे बसंती हो, चाहे वो स्वदेश हो, चाहे वो आपकी मुन्ना भाई भी हो, या आपकी फिल्म्स हैं जो चाहे वो जैसिका लाल मर्डर केस की ऊपर फिल्म हो, या कि जहाँ पे भी स्टेट के अगेंस्ट एक तरीके का मूवमेंट है, वो सारा मूवमेंट सडनली फिर भी दिल है हिंदुस्तानी है, या इतनी रेंज ऑफ फिल्म्स हैं जो कि बिल्कुल नए तरीके से स्टेट को क्वेश्चन कर, इश्यूज दैट many people believed were not even touched in mainstream Hindi cinema, as if there is a mainstream and there is a tributary somewhere else, So the best is that all those tributaries came back. Now this is something that is very interesting to see, that how all these boundaries are eroded. Finally, I would like to conclude with an anecdote which Gulzar introduces in his series that he produced on Mirza Ghalib. Mirza Ghalib, undoubtedly one of the most liked and most widely, I do not know how many people read him, but still, is the most cherished Urdu poets of the 19th, late 18th and early 19th century. उसमें उस सीरीज़ में एक बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग पॉइंट है, जब वो ज़ौक और गालिब के बीच में जो एक आपस में जो उनका एक टसल है, आपस में जो एक जो पोइट्री को लेके उनका वो है. तो ज़ौक इज़ अ कोट पोएट. Now I don't take it otherwise, it's not to demean art film or something, but I believe that whenever courts or whenever Raj, whenever system, whenever governments, whenever otherwise the state, as in the modern terms that we refer to, जब भी state किसी भी चीज़ को कंट्रोल करके और स्टेट कंट्रोल्ड मीडियम कोई आर्ट क्रिएट करेगी, तो वो हमेशा लिमिटेड ही ऑडियंस पे रहेगी, चाहे स्टेट उसको कितनी भी लिबर्टी दे, चाहे उसको आप किसी फॉर्म में. तो एक बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है वो डायलॉग, उसको वो बोलता है कि भाई ज़ौक है और आप तो यू जस्ट राइट पोइट्री और यू डू नॉट गेट एनी रिकग्निशन, बट देन Ghalib is a little upset and he believes कि यार ये this is certainly that कि ज़ौक वो है, and वो तो शाह का मतलब शाह का जो है वो कोट पोएट है, and he gets all the recognition, all the name, but I get nothing. But then suddenly what he finds is एक फ़कीर जा रहा है, and that फ़कीर is singing Ghalib's poetry and Ghalib's verses, and then he goes to a courtesan's house, and there he finds a courtesan is also singing Ghalib's verses, so there, and he says कि भाई this is what perhaps Gulzar is trying to. I don't think that Ghalib ever mentioned these incidents, but perhaps Gulzar introduces it to highlight or to point out that, and Ghalib says कि भाई जिसके गाने या जिसकी गज़लें या जिसकी नज़में या जिसकी verses, एक फ़कीर और एक courtesan, एक जो singer है, जो वो he believed that courtesan is also an art, she's an artist, she's a singer. वो लोग जब गाएंगे और जो जब and people understand, they identify themselves with that. It does not need any Shah, it does not need any state, it does not need any government. Perhaps it is apt here when we see how Hindi cinema over the last 90 years irrespective of all kinds of criticisms. I say criticisms from all corners, not just from the state, even from the scholarship. What has changed in the 21st century? Cinema has evolved itself in terms of technology, in terms of telling stories. Different technological advancements all kinds of technological advancements have helped cinema to grow, to make its stories far better, to tell them far more evocatively. It is a growth of Hindi cinema. Subjects have always been different, from all kinds. But now the most important shift is, since 90s, scholarship. It has found scholarship. जो अमेरिका में 1930s से थी, अब इंडिया में आई है. अब नए, you find all of us, we are all sitting here, we are just trying to understand it. It is getting its recognition. तो हम लोग, एक interesting last anecdote that I share from my personal experience. Philip Ludgendorff, he writes on Hindi cinema a lot. I happen to, I got a chance to work with him in US for a year. So, and there I did a paper on Hindi cinema, in the culture of Hindi cinema, or fan following of Hindi cinema in a small town, Iowa. It's in US. So interesting था कि वो फिलिप मुझे एक बात बोला कि कोई भी सिनेमा उसको recognition तब तक नहीं मिल सकता जब तक इंटेलिजेंसिया उसको recognize नहीं करता. And he told me कि I always loved Hindi cinema, but whenever I spoke to all these Indian scholars and intellectuals here at Iowa or in various other universities in America, I found them a little, defensive or a little ashamed of talking about Hindi cinema, for that matter. He said कि I never realized why it is so. Why do they dislike it? They always talked about one kind of cinema. Philip said that could be Satyajit Ray's cinema or some other cinema, and this Hindi cinema, this mainstream that they call cinema, never got any recognition. But things changed in 90s. Scholarship suddenly realized, majorly because of people like Philip and various other scholars sitting in the West, who believe that this is something that they can explore. And when many Indian scholars or many Indian students visited US for their higher studies, they realized that yes, we can also study Hindi cinema. There are, and attempts were made to theorize it. So that is what you find in Madhav Prasad, in Ravi Vasudevan, in Verdi, and in various other scholars, those who are doing. So now there are issues like gender, ideology, even aesthetics, which many people, Geeta Kapoor and others, started exploring that ideology around 90s. So now we have a fairly good work to initiate. It is not the end. We have just prepared a platform. Some universities have come up with cinema studies departments also, which is again trying to एक तरीके से कर्व करना या एक तरीके से किसी बाउंड्री में बांध देना. So as cinema is open and is liberated, let's keep it so open. So students from all departments, even history students, students from literature, students from, so I would say very specific cinema or art or even political science or social sciences. Sociology में तो सबसे पहले cinema की study शुरू हुई थी इंडिया में. They all can come together and can do it, can study it. So now there is a rich field that we need to explore. We need to go back and we need to see how it has evolved. So the whole idea was to talk about Hindi cinema in the 21st century, in a sense, to see how this cinema has now come to be the cinema that we all like, that we all talk about academically, for our intellectual discourse, for intellectual discussions, not just for entertainment and amusement that we sit back and enjoy it. So I believe there is a lot to do, and I believe I may have given you some thoughts. These are random thoughts that I was asked to share. So if you find any errors or any truti or any mistakes or any misquote, kindly excuse me. That is all, the blame lies with me, so I take all the blame. There could be some gaps also, but you know, in such a short time, I believe it is short time. Yeah, हो सकता है boring रहा हो, बहुत ज़्यादा time लगा हो, so kindly excuse me, and thank you all for being such a patient listener. Thank you.